We're going to chat HYROX because the people love HYROX.
Everybody's chatting HYROX.
Everyone is chatting HYROX. So, what I thought we could talk about with regards to HYROX is some programming.
Cool.
Because the people love your programming.
I don't know if they love mine. They love an idea of. Go on.
Sure. So, let's just talk Gen Pop and how we might think about programming for Gen Pop, let's say 6 weeks. How are we going to approach that?
Okay. I think we need to start first by categorising Gen Pop. So we're talking about general population. So we're thinking about a group of people who use the gym and everything in and around it to upgrade their life outside of it. That's our general categorisation of that thing. Now, as we know, within that, as those individuals become more confident and a little deeper ingrained in the whole fitness industry and the system, they probably become more aware of challenges that they can pose themselves, like HYROX. It's like, okay, I can test this thing that I'm doing and perhaps find some more meaning in it. And so there's probably a shift there from what we would call Gen Pop, which those individuals, we wouldn't actually expect them to use HYROX. There's a shift into what we would call the general athletic pop. And I know that sounds like that's where you're going with this, but it's important because the intention shifts now. Because now we've got an aim with a fixed date attached to it. And so the reason I table that is because we need to be careful around what that date is. Because if we say, okay, we've got 6 weeks to train for an event, we have to consider where they're starting and therefore where they can be in 6 weeks. And for a general population individual, they might be ill-equipped to actually take part in this thing at that point, right? So that's a definite consideration. Like, what are we looking to achieve? Are they just going taking part and they don't mind that it becomes a survival thing, right? They're going doing it for the social and their aim is just to be there with their buddies and see what they can do. So it's like, I'm just going to go and survive it. That's one intention. Are they going to participate? So can they actually do the thing? That's a different thing based on where they are. It's like, what do we need to participate? Or do they actually want to compete? Do they actually want to do better than they've done before or do better than somebody else? Or, you know, have they got some desires that are more athletic? So whilst that all sounds boring and it's a bit like, come on, Master, just want to get into the program design and train, it's important to consider that because that's going to shape the thoughts and the aggression of which we deliver that program design. So first things first, we have to establish a line in the sand, the starting point. Where are they? So that's going to be, what's their previous experience? Where are they up to as far as expression's concerned in everything that relates to HYROX? So what is their aerobic capacity? What is their strength in relation to the strength requirements of HYROX? What is their muscle endurance around the movements that make up HYROX, etc., etc., etc.? We establish that. Like, how far are we away from this thing? Then we have to look at their resources. So how often can they train? What is their ability to manage all the stresses outside the gym and therefore their ability to adapt and therefore the speed of progression, right? What is their biological age? Again, back to their experience. Like, we're thinking about adaptation at this point. Is this somebody that's got good previous experience? They've not necessarily done HYROX, but we know that they're going to adapt quite quickly in 6 weeks, and so we can push the needle. Or is this an older individual, less experience, not got everything figured out and in place, and so their adaptation is going to be much slower? And so 6 weeks might be a bit of a pipe dream, and we're putting them in a shitstorm if we're planning on sending them to HYROX at that point.
So before you carry on...
Sorry. Yeah.
No, that's great. I was just going to pipe up and say, do you feel that the responsibility of the coach is to say to someone who maybe isn't ready for like 6 weeks' time, hey, I think we should maybe look to increase your prep time for HYROX because of those things that you just mentioned? If they don't have the strength, they don't have the endurance already to kind of manage their own expectations of what they can do so that they are not disappointed.
I don't think it's our role to say that you're going to be ill-equipped or you're not going to be ready, because it's ready for what? And this is back to their intention. How do you want that day to feel? So are you willing to put up with the 90 minutes, 2 hour nightmare that is the race to go and have a great weekend away with your friends, right? And if that's the case, then maybe you are. Or do you actually want to do this reasonably well? Do you want to participate or compete? And so then you can go, okay, well, if you want to participate, maybe we're going to be lacking by the time we get to this point if we do it in 6 weeks, right? So we're looking to, as we say, looking to be the holder of truths. We can only find the truths out by establishing the starting point and then getting a rough idea of what their rate of adaptation is going to be so that we can get a projection of what they're going to be capable of on that day. And that's where we can, that's the collaboration piece. So rather than coach saying, and I know this isn't what you mean, but this is what can be sort of heard. Coach goes, you're not going to be ready, or you need to do this. It's more like, okay, this is where we're starting, and this is the rate that we're progressing. So by this point, this is probably how this is going to feel. Is that cool with you? And they're like, I'd rather not. I'd rather it feel good. It's like, okay, cool. We don't have to do that in 6 weeks. Do you know that? Like, we can choose one that's further down the line. That's absolutely fine. And so then we establish the probably a more meaningful plan.
So looking back at that bird's eye view, and we can niche on specific things as they come up. Would you approach that with, the classic periodization, all different training phases? What might that kind of look like? I'm going to assume that ties in with where they're at, and it's going to be very individualized.
Yes, it is. I think if they're already capable and they're up there, we can look at this in some sort of sport periodization way, right? To sort of organize our mind. So we can look at a build of repetitions, and then we can look at creating some intensity around those repetitions so that by the time they get to competition, they're in a good place, right? Even in that, we can hear that 6 weeks is probably a bit of a stretch. Now, can it be done with those with prior experience? Of course it can. Can those with little experience make progress in 6 weeks and be in better condition? Of course they can. Is it where they want to be? This is where the conversation needs to happen. So we want to be, I always say, we want to be mindful of the thoughts that come from sport periodization in those phases, and not just accumulation, intensification, pre-competition, but also in high-low, in managing volume and intensity for each individual. But then once we've considered all those different ways of period, or possible different ways of periodizing, we have to come back to the client. So does it make sense to periodize for this individual, right? So for general population individuals, we always say that life is the periodization tool. So life dictates whether we can be intense or not in the gym based on the stresses that sit outside. So if stress is high outside, then it dictates that our intensity in the gym has to be low. The gym can't be another stressor, they can't recover, so they can't adapt. If stress is low outside, then it's perhaps an opportunity for us to push some intensities in the gym because they can handle that and they can recover and adapt. So all that is still the case when we're thinking about HYROX. Despite the fact that we're leaning into sport, we remember that these folks aren't getting paid for this and they want to go and have a good time. So what we don't want to do is force this thing too much. Whilst we want to prepare them and get them as ready as possible, life's still happening outside the gym, right? So we go, right, we've got 6 weeks. Week 4, something happens at work, they're working long days, the kids are keeping up at night, that they're in a bad state as far as their overall stress is concerned. Are they ready for the intensification block at that point? If we're not paying attention, we'll give them that regardless. Or if they're following an online program, they do that regardless. And actually then by the time they get to competition, they probably carried an injury, not feeling great, not feeling 100%, under the weather, bit sick, So it's like, is it worth it? That's the question, because you're piling stress on an individual whose resiliency is potentially low. So to summarise my whirling thoughts in that, I'm trying to cover all bases. I think we consider periodization for sure as an ideal, but then we have to pay attention to the reality of what's in front of us, and that's the client and their life, their readiness really to do what they can do.
So I'm going to niche down a little bit and just kind of put forward a scenario. We've got someone who's in the Gen Pop athletic section, whatever we call it.
Yep.
and they have a running background.
Hmm.
How might that differ if you were coaching and setting up a program to someone who has done a lot of strength training, who maybe has a lot of running?
It can. Do both those individuals at both ends of the spectrum get what they need? Maybe not. Probably one or the other in that group setting, because the group setting we have to pick something, right? So that we can't create a variable on a theme for everybody that's there, and so we probably go, what do most people need? And if you've got those outliers who are either endurance or strength and not done anything in between, then one of them's probably not going to get what they need. That being said, there are definitely considerations to be made for those individuals. We have to then, this takes us to what we would call the functional volume. So what is HYROX? The great thing for coaches about HYROX is that the race is fixed. We know what's in it. So if we compare that to CrossFit, where we know what's involved as far as what the movements look like, even to an extent what the movements are. We don't know how they're going to be presented, what the dose is, what the challenge is, etc., etc. Here we do, and so it is quite simple. We have a fixed functional volume, so we know that you have to run 8k, so that's a fixed functional volume. So can the strength person run 8k? If they can't, then their first port of call is going to be accumulating the ability to run 8 kilometers before we even get into any fancy stuff around intensities or intervals or fatigue based, etc., etc. So that strength person, it's like your first job. You need to build the volume to run the distance. For the person that's run hundreds, thousands of kilometers, and 8k is a drop in the ocean for them, for the endurance person, we look at the functional volume around the strength elements. And whilst they might not be a big thing for the strength person, they have to be strong enough to push the sled. They have to be strong enough to do that amount of wall balls. They have to be strong enough to do the lunge walk, etc., etc. Carry the kettlebells. Even manage the amount of dynamic contractions of your upper push through the burpee, which in a lot of times is taken as read. So yeah, what happens, the easy thing for the coach for these two individuals is there's an obvious priority, right? And also the fact that they don't need to worry about their strengths. That's going to be there. So this person doesn't need to worry about running. Like 8k is fine for them. This person doesn't need to worry about pushing the sled or doing the wall balls. They need to build the capacity in order to complete that amount of repetitions and move for what's going to be, the likelihood of 75 to 90 minutes.
So I've seen social media quite a lot in these HYROX workouts that people like to share. A lot of compromise running, a lot of fatigue-based stuff. What is your kind of response to that? How does that fit into a program for Jump Hop? Does it fit into a program for Jump Hop? What are those considerations?
So the reality of HYROX is that if we break it down, or we try and not break it down, if we try and summarize like what is this thing, it is a fatigue run, right? I think that's exactly what it is. So the aim of the game should be to get there at some point where we're probably the challenge for those running activities or those running training sessions is that fatigue based. So that would be the challenge in the end. But there's no point and there's no value in going straight there from the off, because first and foremost we need to develop the capacity to run the distance, like we mentioned before. That's first and foremost. So we know that that's the sexy stuff, and we know that it's like that's what everybody's doing, which is fine, but there's a prerequisite to get there. So it's the same as marathon running, it's the same as tri, it's the same as Ironman. It's like, if you've not done the distance, your first aim is to accumulate the distance. So can you do the distance first? So can you run a marathon? If not, there's no point doing intervals. As we know in endurance sport, speed kills. So we need to find the paces, we need to find that management, we need to get that feel and intuition, we need to build the base so that then, over time, and this is something that a lot of people I think miss the mark on in training for these events, they only consider the next event. and they see that as the be all end all, as opposed to that just being one goal, one milestone in a huge line of many goals and milestones that are going to play out over the coming years. Maybe the next 10 of those being HYROX related. So this is your first stab at it. And in actual fact, when we talk about getting a line in the sand, the best line in the sand is probably your first HYROX. Like, that's the reality of where we're up to. That's going to give us back some great feedback and some priorities around what we should focus on in your training. Like, where was it hardest for you? Right? Was it your pacing? Was it the running? Was it this? Where was it? What was really tough? And perhaps we should focus on that thing. So, it's not a bad thing to just to do the simple work to get to the point where we can do the race. And then we can iterate on that, and at some point further down the line, and this is when we're able, so the individual at this point has the ability to do it, then we aim to get to the point where we do some compromise running, because that's what it is. So it's huge lower body activity, not huge, it's a lot of lower body activity, and yeah, it's your ability to maintain a pace in running despite having accumulated a load of fatigue in the legs. So training should probably look like that for those that are able. So over time, it's like, can we get to the point where you can express a session that looks like a load of squat pattern, a load of lunge pattern, and running, and recover from it and come back and train the next day. Like, that would be a great place to get to. But we can hear in that it's probably going to take some time to get to the point where that looks like a standard day of training. Probably for some individuals, maybe even a couple of years. So yeah, I think all of the things that people are doing, I think it's along the right path for those that can. But as usual, what tends to happen is there's little thought as to who that's applied to. So it's like, this looks like how the best train for HYROX, so everybody should train in this way. It's probably not the case. And so we have to think about, when we're talking about Gen Pop, like, where are they at? Can they do this? Can they do this thing? Can they do 100 squats in a session and wall balls on top and running and all the rest of it, and that be their fatigue base? Or is that going to cripple them and end up in compensatory patterns, limited recovery, injury, all the rest of it? Like, what's the point for one HYROX when the potential is that we can come back and do this time and again over the next few years if you want? That's the beauty of HYROX. So yeah, careful with it. Careful with the sims. Same thing. Similar to where CrossFit done poorly ends up. The thought that just doing CrossFit gets you good at CrossFit. It's like, no, that's not what happens, because what we see in CrossFit competitions is the test. That's the outcome, and there's a difference between training and testing. Training is something that we can recover from, and we talk about we're looking for this hormesis, right? So we're looking for create stress, adapt, grow, and so your line of homeostasis is nudged along, right? You're nudging the needle of what you're capable of, your resiliency. That's what we do through training. The test is like can you manage this thing? It creates a response, but it's not a long-lasting response, because as soon as you remove that stress, naturally, and from an evolutionary point of view, it stops. So the output of that stops. So yeah, we just have to think about all that stuff. Like, continuing to do a HYROX race every week is not the way to get better at HYROX. It's going to be training towards that thing. It would be the way.